They say there's a place in the Venetian Lagoon where the water remembers every soul it has carried. An island so cursed its name is spoken only in whispers. Its soil is half ash, half human bone. Its fires once burned for months without dying. And when the mist rolls in, the living hear the same bell that once tolled for the dead, even though no church has stood there for centuries. Tonight, we sail to that forbidden shore, to walk streets swallowed by time, to uncover secrets buried in plague and fire, and to learn why those who set foot on Poveglia never truly leave. This is not just a story. It is an invitation and a warning. They say that on still nights, when the lagoon lies flat as a sheet of black glass, a sound drifts across the water that should not exist. A single bell tolling, deep and solemn, somewhere out there in the dark. The fishermen of Venice have heard it. The old ones lower their voices when they speak of it, their eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon. The younger ones scoff, but they do not sail near the place it comes from, because everyone in these parts knows there is no church on Poveglia Island. There hasn't been for centuries. And yet, the bell still rings. The island lies just beyond the Lido, a low shape crouched in the lagoon, hidden under a shroud of cypress trees. On bright days you can see it from the edge of Venice, if you know where to look, a smudge of green and stone, almost ordinary in the sunlight. But at dusk, when the mists begin to roll in from the Adriatic, it vanishes. Some say the fog there is thicker, heavier, as though it remembers the smoke of old fires and refuses to let go. Among the fishing families of Burano and Chioggia, the island's name is spoken rarely and never after dark. Children are told it's cursed. The men call it the place of the burning earth. They say the soil there is black with ash, and that no boat that lands uninvited ever comes back the same way. It is not a story they tell to frighten tourists. It is a story they tell because their grandfathers told it, and because it has always been true. Luca Barisi had grown up hearing these whispers. His father was a fisherman, like his father before him, and the family boat had passed from one generation to the next. They fished the shoals near Murano, cast their nets for squid in the deeper waters, and sold their catch in the Rialto market. Luca knew the rules of the lagoon, where the currents hid sandbanks, which channels to avoid at low tide, and, above all, which places you never sailed to, no matter how calm the sea. But rules are a difficult thing for a young man with restless blood. Luca had been born with the look of someone who wanted more than the horizon would give him. He spent his nights on the docks, listening to the old men tell stories, watching the city lights flicker on the water, and wondering how much of their talk was truth and how much was just salt-soaked fantasy. And always there was the story of the bell. The older fishermen swore it was a warning. The bell rang, they said, to mark another soul claimed by the island. Others claimed it was the voice of the dead themselves, calling to the living. But Luca could not accept the idea of a sound without a source. A bell needed a tower needed a foundation, and foundations meant stone, something you could see, touch, and understand. One evening in late autumn, with the market quiet and his father away in Chioggia, Luca found himself alone on the boat. The tide was high, the lagoon strangely still, and a thin mist lay low over the water. Somewhere in that gray silence, the bell began to ring. It was not loud, yet it seemed to travel straight through the air, as if the sound had skipped the space between. A slow, deliberate toll, and then another. The hairs on Luca's arms lifted, but he gripped the tiller tighter. He had heard enough of this story from others. Now he would see for himself. He untied the boat from its mooring, pushed off, and let the oars dip into the water. The air was colder out on the open lagoon, and it carried a faint scent he couldn't place, not the salt of the Adriatic, but something darker, heavier. As he rowed, the sound of the bell grew clearer, more measured, until it seemed to keep pace with the rhythm of his strokes. He knew roughly where Poveglia lay, though he had never been near it. Most maps left it unnamed, a blank space in the lagoon. But the fishermen knew the channels, and Luca had studied them in secret. A half-hour's rowing, maybe less if the water stayed this calm. As the shape of the island began to form in the mist, the smell reached him more strongly. Smoke, yes, but not the clean smoke of wood fires. This was acrid, sharp, the kind that clings to your skin. And beneath it, a sour note, almost metallic, the scent of rot. The bell tolled again. Luca glanced at the sails, thinking he might raise them to close the distance faster, but stopped. There was no wind, not a breath of it. The surface of the water was unbroken, yet he noticed something strange. The boat had begun to move faster without his rowing. He lifted the oars, and still the bow cut steadily forward, ripples spreading in widening arcs. The island grew larger. The cypress trees stood black against the low sky, their branches twisting as if in pain. The bell continued its slow rhythm, though he could see no tower, no roof, no sign of a church at all. The shoreline ahead was a jumble of stone and tangled weeds, parts of it submerged where the lagoon had eaten away at the foundations. And then he saw movement. At first he thought it was a trick of the mist, a shape darker than the shadows, standing near the waterline. As the boat drew closer, the figure became clearer. Tall, robed, the head bowed slightly as if in greeting. One arm was raised, the hand making a slow, deliberate motion, beckoning him in. The bell tolled again, closer now, though it seemed to come from all around him at once. Something in Luca's chest tightened. He meant to reach for the oars, to turn the boat, but the water beneath him had become strangely heavy, dragging him forward like an invisible tide. The figure's hand continued its steady wave, and Luca felt, for the first time, a chill deeper than the autumn air, a cold that seemed to move inside his bones. The mist shifted for a moment, and in that space between breaths, he saw it. The figure's feet did not touch the sand. They hung inches above it, the robe swaying gently in a wind that did not exist. The bell rang once more, and the sound seemed to swallow the world. They say Poveglia's earth is unlike any other in the Venetian Lagoon. Black, coarse, strangely warm to the touch, it crumbles between your fingers into a dust that smells faintly of burned wood and something darker. The old fisherman will tell you why in hushed tones. The soil is made of half ash, half human bone. Not in metaphor, but in truth. For centuries, storms have unearthed shards of skull and rib, pale splinters jutting from the ground like the remnants of some buried beast. And every fragment tells a part of the island's oldest wound, the years when Poveglia burned with 1,000 fires. It began in the middle of the 14th century, when the Black Death reached Venice. The city was a jewel of trade, a place where ships from the east and west exchanged silks, spices, and secrets. But that beauty was its curse. Disease travels fastest along the routes of commerce, and Venice's canals became the veins through which the plague's poison spread. At first, the city tried to contain it. Quarantine measures were declared, ships held in the harbor for 40 days, cargo burned, and suspected houses sealed. But the death toll rose with each passing tide. Soon there were too many corpses for the narrow streets to bear, and worse, too many still clinging to life, their bodies marked with the black swellings that foretold the end. The Senate made its decision. The sick, the suspected, and the dead would be taken away, out of sight, to a place where they could no longer infect the city. Poveglia, small and isolated, ringed by shallow waters, was chosen. Its few remaining inhabitants were ordered to leave. The bells of the city rang not in mourning, but in warning. The island was now a place of exile. The first boats carried only the dead. They arrived at dawn, when the mist still clung to the water, and the silence was broken only by the slap of waves against the hull. Men in long-nosed plague masks, beaks stuffed with herbs to ward off infection, hauled the bodies ashore and heaped them into great pits. Fires were lit, and soon a column of black smoke rose into the sky, drifting over the lagoon like a banner of despair. But as the days passed, the cargo changed. No longer only the dead, now the dying came too. Whole families, torn from their homes, their children crying, their skin already fevered. They were told they would be cared for. In truth, the island had no physicians, no medicine, no hope. It had only the fires. Every morning more boats came. Some held 10, some 20, some nearly capsizing under the weight of their human load. The sick were left on the shore, sometimes to wander a few days among the mounds of ash before their bodies failed, sometimes to collapse within hours. The dead were fed to the flames, their smoke mingling with the sea breeze, carrying the bitter scent back toward the city that had abandoned them. The screams became part of the island's air, The high wails of the fevered, the low moans of those too weak to stand, the sudden, sharp cries of the newly arrived when they saw what awaited them. And beneath it all, the roar of the fires, constant and unyielding. In time, something strange began to happen. Not all who came to the island died quickly. A few lingered. They survived days, even weeks, though their bodies bore the marks of the plague. These survivors did not heal. They changed. At first, it was in their eyes, a strange brightness, fever's glow without its weakness. Then in their voices, low and guttural, words slurred as though their tongues no longer obeyed them. Some grew violent, attacking the sick and the living alike, dragging them toward the fires as if eager to see them burn. Others wandered to the island's center, scratching symbols into the soil, muttering to themselves in languages no one recognized. One man, whose name the records never kept, became the most feared among them. He had been a gondolier, taken from his home after his wife and son died in the same night. For days he lay among the other infected, silent, unmoving. Then one night he rose. His fever was gone, but his eyes were black from edge to edge, reflecting no light. He began to walk the island, speaking to the dead as though they could hear him. When the plague-masked attendants tried to restrain him, he fought with a strength no starved, sick man should possess. They locked him in one of the stone storehouses left behind by Poveglia's former residents, hoping he would starve. But in the mornings, they would find strange shapes carved into the walls, spirals, intersecting lines, and always a small circle marked with an X in its center. It was said that once, during a rare lull in the dying, a young attendant spoke with him through the bars. The gondolier told him he had seen the plague's true nature, that it was not merely a sickness, but a door, that those who burned in the fires were not destroyed, but changed, drawn into something vast and unseen, waiting just beyond the reach of the living. The attendant laughed nervously, thinking it the madness of fever. But then the man did something that chilled him. He bit into his own wrist, tearing the flesh, and with his blood began to draw on the cell wall. Not the strange symbols this time, but a crude map of the island. In its center, deep inland among the cypress trees, he marked a single spot, the same circle with the X. When the attendant asked what it meant, the man whispered, "That is where they come through." That night, without warning, the gondolier's cell caught fire. There was no torch nearby, no spark from the cooking pits. The stone walls glowed red, and the screams inside were unlike anything the island had heard before, not pain, but a sound like joy. By morning, nothing was left but ash, the blood-drawn map still etched into the wall. The attendants told no one. The Senate would not care, and the people of Venice would not want to know. But the story spread among the plague workers, passed in low voices over the hiss of the fires. Some began to avoid the island center, steering their tasks toward the shore. Others claimed to have seen flickers in the fog, shapes moving too quickly, too silently to be the sick. And still, the boats came. As months turned to years, Poveglia became less an island than a grave. The pits filled and were filled again, layer upon layer, until the soil itself was transformed. The cypress roots drank from the ash, their trunks growing black and twisted. The fires never truly went out. Even in the rain, the earth would smoke, as if it remembered the burning. Those who worked there long enough began to feel it. The heaviness in the air. The way sound carried differently, as though the island was listening. Some reported dreams that lingered into waking, dreams of standing on a shore not of this world, where the water was black and still, and shapes moved beneath its surface. And always there was the bell. Even in those plague years, when the church had long been abandoned and its tower fallen, the sound would ring out over the fires. Slow, patient, as though counting each soul that left the living. The attendants stopped remarking on it. Some began to time their tasks to its tolls, moving bodies in between, as if the bell itself commanded them. When the worst of the plague passed, Venice reclaimed its markets and its palaces. The dead were mourned, the survivors tried to forget. But Poveglia remained. Its soil was now too poisoned for crops, too haunted for homes. The Senate left it to the birds and the wind. But those who had worked there, who had heard the screams and seen the black-eyed survivors, knew the island would never truly be empty. And somewhere, deep inland among the cypress trees, the spot the gondolier marked waited. It is said that in the decades after, a few brave or foolish men tried to find it. None returned with proof. Some never returned at all. Even now, centuries later, storms will sometimes strip the topsoil from the island's shore, exposing pale shards of bone to the sun. And when the mist is thick, fishermen swear they can smell the burning, as though 1,000 fires had been lit again. The map, the survivors, the whispers of a door, all of it became part of the island's shadowed history. But the truth, the full truth, waits still beneath the cypress, marked in blood, hidden in earth made from ash and bone. And when the bell rings over the water, some say it is not the dead calling, but the door opening. The lagoon was gray that morning, the kind of color that swallows the horizon so completely you can no longer tell where the water ends and the sky begins. Luca Barisi sat in his small fishing boat, the oars resting still in their locks, his hands idle for the first time in hours. He had anchored, though he could not have said why. Something in the air felt patient, as though it were waiting for him. The surface of the water was strangely calm. No wind, no current, only the slow rocking of his own weight. It was then he saw it. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a scrap of refuse drifting by, a piece of paper, perhaps, or the torn skin of a gull's wing. But as it neared, he realized it was caught in the mouth of a small green bottle. The glass was scuffed and old, barnacles clinging to its lower half, but the cork was sealed tight. It moved against the water as though being drawn toward his boat, not carried by it. Curiosity overrode the faint prickle in his spine. He reached over, plucked it from the lagoon, and sat back with it in his hands. The glass was cold, almost biting, and he thought he heard, though surely he imagined it, a faint ringing, like the echo of a bell trapped inside. With a twist of his fingers, the cork came free. The smell that escaped was strange, a mingling of iron, smoke, and salt, the scent of a place where fire has long since burned itself into the earth. He turned the bottle upside down and let the contents slide into his palm. A rolled piece of parchment, no bigger than his hand. The paper was unlike anything he'd seen. It was soft but strong, and the color of aged bone. When he unrolled it, his breath caught. The markings on it were red, not the brown red of dried ink, but a vivid crimson, wet to the touch. It was fresh, impossibly fresh, as though drawn only moments before. And the drawing, it was a map. It was crude yet deliberate, the outline of an island, marked with jagged strokes, its edges encircled by waves. Near its center, a single small circle, crossed with an X. Luca's eyes widened. He had seen this before, not with his own eyes, but in the whispered tales of plague workers, fishermen, and madmen. It was the same mark rumored to have been scratched in blood on the wall of a prison cell centuries ago by a survivor of the Black Death. The mark that told of a place deep in Poveglia's heart. The ink, or whatever it was, smeared slightly under his touch, but did not fade. It was as if the parchment wanted to remember the shape, no matter what was done to it. Luca folded it carefully, though the movement was useless. He already knew what he would do. The island loomed in the mist like a black tooth breaking the surface of the lagoon. He could see the cypress trees from here, tall and unmoving, their shapes blurred into strange forms by the fog. He dipped his oars into the water. The sound of them was unnaturally loud in the silence. As he rowed, the map weighed heavy in his pocket. It felt wrong to carry it, as though it belonged not to him but to the island itself. The closer he drew, the thicker the mist became, wrapping around the boat, swallowing the sun until the day turned dim and colorless. His breath made small clouds in the air, and the smell returned, smoke and rot, faint but undeniable. The shoreline emerged, jagged with stone and littered with tangled weeds. He could see no path, but the map's lines seemed to hum in his mind, pulling him toward a narrow break in the cypress wall. He stepped out of the boat into shallow water, his boots sinking slightly into the black sand. The trees closed around him like the bars of a cage. Their trunks were blackened, as though a fire had once raged here, licking them up from root to crown. He touched one, expecting the charcoal to flake under his hand, but the bark was solid, smooth, and warm. Too warm for the chill of the day. He moved deeper into the interior. The air grew heavier, each breath carrying a faint sting. The ground underfoot was littered with what he thought at first were pale stones. But when his gaze fell closer, he saw the truth. But small fragments, large shards, some so weathered they had fused with the earth. He quickened his pace without meaning to. The map's mark led him on, deeper into the mist. The light dimmed further. The smell grew sharper. Then ahead, the trees opened into a wide clearing. Luca froze. The earth here was scorched black, the ground cracked and uneven as if burned in some great fire centuries ago. Yet as he stepped forward, he realized the air shimmered faintly above it, the way it does above coals in a hearth. The soil radiated heat. Thin tendrils of smoke curled up in lazy spirals, and when he crouched to touch one of the cracks, a faint orange glow pulsed within. This place had burned long before he was born, long before his father's time, and yet, somehow, it still burned. A sound came from the far side of the clearing, a soft rustle, like dry leaves shifting in a wind that wasn't there. He straightened, eyes narrowing. The mist seemed to thicken, twisting itself into faint shapes that vanished when he tried to focus. The heat pressed against him from all sides, as though the earth itself was breathing. He turned to leave, to follow the mark on the map to wherever it might lead next, when the sound came again. Only it wasn't leaves. It was a voice. Soft, high, and unmistakably that of a child. It spoke his name. The sound slid through him like cold water. He spun toward it, searching the smoky edges of the clearing. His name again, this time closer. It was not calling in fear or urgency, but almost playfully, as if inviting him to follow. The mist shifted, and for an instant he thought he saw a small shape in the smoke, no taller than his waist, standing just at the line where the blackened ground met the trees. But before he could move, the shape was gone, leaving only the lingering sound of his name hanging in the heat. The embers beneath his feet flared, and the voice spoke once more. And then the clearing fell silent. The mist over Poveglia had a way of changing shape when you looked at it too long. Luca had already learned not to trust what his eyes told him here, but the voice he'd heard in the clearing, the child's voice that spoke his name, was not something he could ignore. It had sounded so close, yet when he searched, the ground was empty. The blackened soil still smoldered faintly under his boots, the heat rising in slow, invisible streams. He took a step toward the treeline, and the world shifted. Somewhere in the fog ahead, laughter broke the silence. It was soft at first, carried on the air like the sound of water lapping against the hull of a boat. But there was no water here, only the dry, scorched clearing and the forest beyond. The laugh was unmistakably that of a child, bright and breathless, the kind you might hear in a sunlit street when games are played. But here, in this place where nothing living had walked for centuries, the sound was impossible. Luca hesitated. His chest tightened as though his heart were warning him against the direction his ears pulled him toward. But the laughter came again, louder now, and joined by another. 2 voices, then 3. They overlapped, weaving around each other in a strange, lilting rhythm. He stepped forward, leaving the warmth of the scorched ground behind. The cypress trees loomed around him again, their trunks black and twisted. The mist curled low along the forest floor, parting only where his boots disturbed it. The laughter danced just ahead, as though leading him. After some time, though here, time felt as warped as the air, he stumbled upon something pale among the roots. At first glance it looked like driftwood, the kind he might find tangled in fishing nets. But as he bent to pick it up, the truth revealed itself. It was a toy, a tiny horse, crudely carved, its legs uneven, its body worn smooth by countless touches. And it was not made of wood. The surface was pale and porous, the edges splintered in a way only bone could splinter. Human bone. The laughter came again, closer now. Luca's stomach churned, but he did not drop the toy. Something about its weight, its texture, held him. He turned it in his hands and saw faint lines scratched along its sides, not decorations, but tally marks, each etched deep as though by a desperate hand. He placed it gently back on the ground and moved on. The deeper he walked, the more toys he found. A small spinning top, its handle worn to a nub. A hollow flute, its surface darkened by age, with a crack running the length of it. A doll with no face, only a smooth oval where features should be. All of them were carved from bone. All of them bore marks, scratches, symbols, spirals. And all of them were warm. The laughter swelled suddenly, rising into a chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. It no longer sounded like simple amusement. There was a rhythm to it now, a strange pulse, as though each voice was keeping time with the others. The playful edge had dulled into something more measured, more deliberate. Luca stopped in a small clearing ringed with roots and stones. The ground here was littered with the toys, far more than he had seen before. They lay scattered like leaves, hundreds of pale shapes half hidden in the mist. The laughter shifted. Words began to form within it, broken syllables, slurred and drawn out, tangled in the sound of breathless mirth. He strained to make sense of them, and slowly, he realized they were not words from any language he knew. Yet they carried the cadence of speech, rising and falling in a way that prickled his skin. It was a chant. The rhythm tightened, the voices overlapping in perfect, unnatural unison. And as they chanted, the toys began to move. At first, it was only a twitch, a rocking of the tiny horse he'd found earlier. Then another toy rolled over, then another. The movement spread outward like ripples in water, each toy shifting as though pushed by unseen hands. They slid across the ground, the sound of bones scraping against soil filling the air. Luca took a step back, but the toys followed, their slow, deliberate movements gathering into a pattern. They were arranging themselves. One by one, they formed a circle around him. He turned, looking for a gap, but each time he moved toward one, the toys closed ranks, their pale forms pressing together until they formed an unbroken ring. The chant grew louder, and with it came a change in the air, a coldness that sank into his skin, deeper than the mist, deeper than the damp. The symbols carved into the toys began to glow faintly, as though lit from within. Luca's breath came faster. He knew, without knowing how, that the ring was not meant to keep him in place by accident. This was deliberate. The chant broke suddenly into silence. And in that silence, something touched him. It was small, almost delicate, wrapping around his ankle just above the boot. The touch was so cold it burned, the sensation sinking straight into the bone. He looked down. There was nothing there. The grip tightened. A jolt shot up his leg, and before he could cry out, his foot was yanked sharply backward. The ground gave way beneath him, the circle of toys collapsing inward. Soil and mist rushed past his face as he was pulled down, deeper, the world above shrinking to a pale, distant disk. The last thing he heard before the earth swallowed him whole was the laughter, no longer bright, no longer playful, but low and satisfied, as if the game had finally been won. And then darkness. The earth swallowed Luca so suddenly that he had no sense of falling, only of being taken. One heartbeat he was surrounded by the ring of bone toys and the cold hand on his ankle. The next he was moving downward through darkness that felt thicker than air, pressing in on him from all sides. Soil scraped his shoulders, filled his mouth, lodged under his fingernails. There was no light, yet his eyes seemed to strain toward shapes that might not have been there at all. Then, without warning, the constriction vanished. He tumbled forward and landed hard on something that was not stone, not earth, something that gave under his weight with a dull, hollow sound. The impact forced the air from his lungs. When he inhaled again, the smell hit him, the staleness of air that has not moved for centuries, laced with the dry tang of bone dust and the faint, bitter sting of decay. His eyes adjusted slowly to a dim, reddish glow seeping from somewhere unseen. He found himself on his knees, surrounded by a space so vast that his mind refused to believe it could exist beneath the island. A cavern, but more than that, a catacomb. The ceiling soared high above him, its vaults lost in shadow. The walls were lined in neat, endless rows of skulls, their sockets turned outward like the eyes of an audience that had been watching for a very long time. And between those skulls, set into the packed bone like seams in masonry, were teeth. Hundreds, thousands of them, catching the faint glow and throwing it back in dull, uneven glints. The walls glittered with them, as though the very air had gnawed away the flesh and kept the bite. He rose slowly, his boots crunching on something brittle. Looking down, he saw he was standing on a floor made not of stone but of bone fragments, crushed underfoot until they had become a kind of pale gravel. The sound was loud in the silence, and he realized with a start that there was another sound beneath it. Breathing, not his own. He froze. The breath was steady, deliberate. It came from somewhere ahead, deep in the shadowed tunnel that stretched beyond the edge of the glow. He tested the air again with his own lungs, and the sound answered, a long, slow inhale that matched the rhythm of his own, as though the darkness were drawing in the same breath he took. He turned his head sharply, and the sound shifted too, keeping time with him, mocking the act of living. He began to move forward, unwilling but unable to stand still. The walls closed in slightly, the skulls pressing closer, their teeth flashing in the gloom. The breathing grew louder, until it seemed the cavern itself was alive, its every inhale pulling at him with an invisible tide. As he rounded a bend in the passage, the glow deepened, becoming the color of embers. He could see the source now, a deep pit in the floor, perfectly circular, its walls worn smooth. The air that rose from it was warm, and with every pulse of breath from the darkness below, the embers lining its depths flared faintly. He had heard of these. During the Black Death, when Poveglia was choked with bodies, the plague pits had been dug deeper and deeper until they touched the water table. Some became so deep they never cooled, the layers of ash and charred bone holding the heat for centuries. The stories called them wells, though no water had ever been drawn from them. The plague workers claimed the pits could breathe. No one had believed them. Until now. Luca stepped to the edge and peered down. The glow was hypnotic, pulling his gaze inward, downward. The breathing rose again, warm against his face. He tried to step back, and that was when he saw the hand. It emerged from the darkness below with the slow grace of something that did not need to hurry. Skeletal, yes, but not fragile. The bones gleamed faintly, and the fingers moved with the precision of a living thing. It rose until it was level with his knee, and in its palm lay a small, round object. A Venetian coin. The kind struck centuries ago, worn thin by age. The hand tilted slightly, offering it to him. And then, from nowhere and everywhere at once, came the whisper. You belong here now. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was the voice of stone settling, of waves in a cave, of something patient enough to wait forever. Luca's hand moved of its own accord. His fingers closed around the coin. It was colder than the hand that held it. The skeletal grip released him, and the hand sank slowly back into the dark, disappearing into the breathing pit. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The coin lay inert in his palm, its surface slick with condensation. He turned it over, and his eyes widened. The map symbol, the circle with the X. It was stamped into the coin's surface. Heat surged suddenly from the metal, so intense it stole the air from his lungs. He cried out and tried to drop it, but his hand refused to open. The pain seared upward through his fingers, racing into his arm, and the glow from the pit flared until it filled his vision. When at last his hand opened, the coin was gone. In its place, burned into the flesh of his palm, was the symbol itself, blackened and raw, the edges smoking faintly as though the brand had just been made. The breathing from the pit deepened, and somewhere far away in the darkness, another voice, softer, almost lost in the echo, began to laugh. And Luca understood, with the kind of clarity that cuts deeper than fear, that he had just been claimed. The mark in Luca's palm throbbed with a slow, deep pulse, as though the coin that had burned it there had left more than a scar. It felt alive. Every time his heartbeat quickened, the brand seemed to answer, a heat that climbed into his wrist and spread through his arm like a slow poison. He could not stop staring at it, and yet, each time his eyes lingered too long, the lines of the circle and the X seemed to shift, bending into shapes that didn't belong to any language he knew. The breathing pit behind him was silent now, but the air in the catacombs had changed. The stillness was gone. Somewhere beyond the walls of bone, something had begun to stir. He could hear it in the faint scrape of metal on stone, in the whisper of movement where no wind could possibly reach. And then in the distance, a light began to glow. It was weak at first, a pale shimmer seeping through the mist that clung to the tunnel ahead. But as it brightened, it took on shape. Luca's breath caught. It wasn't a lantern or a torch. It was a window, high, arched, and framed in crumbling brick. The light beyond it was sickly yellow, the color of old paper held too close to a flame. And above that window, rising higher than seemed possible in the confines of the island, was a tower. The fog thickened around its base, wrapping it like a shroud, but the upper floors emerged in jagged detail. Narrow balconies, barred openings, a roof that sloped steeply toward a spire. The stone was dark with age, though here and there the pale scars of repair work caught the light. It should not have been here. The old fisherman had told him the hospital was demolished decades ago, its stones left to rot into the soil. And yet, here it stood as solid as if the workers had left it yesterday. The brand in his palm burned hotter. He moved toward the tower without deciding to. The ground changed under his feet, no longer the crunch of bone dust, but the smooth, worn surface of tile. The walls of skulls gave way to plaster, cracked and peeling, and the air carried a sharp tang of antiseptic that barely masked the deeper scent beneath. Sickness and something else. Through the windows, shapes began to flicker. They moved in jerks, like shadows caught in a faulty film reel. He stepped into a corridor, its walls lined with iron hooks and chains that rattled softly though he felt no draft. At the far end, a set of double doors banged open, and two men in white coats emerged, pushing a gurney between them. The patient strapped to it thrashed wildly, her mouth open in a scream that made no sound. Her eyes were wide, and her skin glistened with sweat. The men's faces were gray and indistinct, their features blurred as though smeared by a wet brush. They passed him without looking, the wheels of the gurney squealing against the tiles. Behind them came another pair, and another, each bearing their cargo of screaming, silent patients. Some wept. Some strained against their bonds until their wrists bled. A few lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if following something only they could see. The corridor narrowed ahead, forcing him to follow the procession. The further they went, the more the walls closed in, and the more the chains multiplied, hanging from the ceiling like iron vines. In the dim corners, he began to notice stains, dark smears that ran from hook to floor, as though the walls themselves had bled. They came to another set of doors, taller than the last. The orderlies filed through, and Luca followed, stepping into a room that felt larger than the tower itself should have allowed. This was no hospital ward. It was a theater. The walls rose in tiers, each lined with benches. The air reeked of damp stone and the coppery tang of blood. In the center of the room stood an operating table, its metal surface reflecting the yellow light from the lamps above. And beside it, bent over a tray of instruments, was a man in a white coat. Luca's eyes went first to the doctor's hands. They were steady, deliberate, arranging the tools with a precision that spoke of long practice. Scalpels, bone saws, forceps, all of them gleaming as though freshly sharpened. Then the man turned toward him. Where his face should have been was a blur, as if the air between them was smeared like wet paint. It shifted faintly, almost revealing a cheekbone, the curve of a mouth, but then it would dissolve again into formlessness. Only the eyes were clear. They were human, strikingly so, dark, steady, and unblinking. And they were familiar. The doctor moved toward the table. The patient waiting there, a man whose arms were strapped to the sides, began to tremble. The straps creaked under his weight. The doctor leaned close to him, murmuring something too soft for Luca to hear, then reached for the scalpel. The orderlies moved to hold the patient down, their blurred faces expressionless. The metal flashed in the light, and the brand in Luca's palm flared with heat so sudden and intense that he staggered. The doctor's eyes turned to him. Luca's breath caught. They were his own. Not just similar, they were exactly his. The same shape, the same flecks of gold near the center, the same way the pupils narrowed when the light struck them. The scalpel in the doctor's hand stilled, then lowered. He stepped toward Luca, the space between them collapsing until they stood almost close enough to touch. The blurred face leaned nearer, and for an instant, the features tried to form, and Luca thought he saw his own expression staring back at him. The heat in his palm became unbearable. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bending inward, the tiers of benches collapsing into shadow. The doctor reached out, placing his cold, gloved hand over Luca's branded one. And in a voice that was his own, the doctor whispered, "You've been here before." The world buckled. The chains rattled like wind-blown leaves. And Luca realized, with the terrible certainty that only comes when memory surfaces from some locked place, that he could not deny it. The eyes, the voice, the mark, they were all his. And the tower was still waiting. The light in the operating theater had changed. It was no longer the dim, yellowed glow of sickroom lamps, but a harsher, colder brightness, the kind that shows every shadow, every flaw, every drop of blood. Luca stood in the center of it, his gaze fixed on the rusted tray at his side. An old scalpel lay there. Its handle was tarnished, its blade dulled at the edges, but at the tip, a thin bead of fresh blood clung stubbornly, trembling with the faint tremor in the air. He could smell it, copper and salt, sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. The rest of the instruments lay scattered as if abandoned mid-procedure, their edges catching the light in quick, sharp flashes. He reached for the scalpel without meaning to. His fingers curled around the handle, and a jolt of something, memory or the shadow of it, surged up his arm. The brand in his palm burned against the cold metal. When he looked up again, the theater had changed. The benches above were full. Not with living people, but with figures leaning forward in perfect stillness, their faces shadowed, their eyes glinting like glass. Below them, on the table, a patient waited, a man strapped down with leather belts, his limbs twitching in small, involuntary spasms. The man's mouth moved and sound came out, but not words Luca recognized. It was a dialect older than his grandfather's time, older perhaps than the city itself. It rose and fell in desperate tones, the plea of someone who knows the outcome and begs for it to be anything but what it will be. Luca opened his mouth to say he didn't understand, to tell the man he wasn't supposed to be here, but no sound came. Instead, his body moved as though on rails, the scalpel lifting, his other hand positioning the man's head at just the right angle. The room leaned in, waiting. The blade touched skin. The moment it broke the surface, something inside Luca shifted. It was as if a door had opened, not in the room, but in his mind. He could feel the weight of every procedure he had ever performed, though he had no memory of learning them. His hands knew exactly where to cut, how deep, how to avoid the bleeding that would end things too soon. The motions were smooth, economical, practiced. The man on the table began to scream. The dialect was the same, but now the words were harder, edged with terror and rage. Luca's mind translated fragments without his consent. "Stop. I see them. Behind you. Please." But his hands did not stop. The theater blurred at the edges. One patient became another, a woman with a long braid coiled on the table like a rope, her face wet with tears. Then a boy no older than 12, his eyes huge in a face far too thin. Each time, the same ancient words. Each time, his hands working with that same mechanical certainty. With every operation, the memories sharpened. He knew the sounds the saw would make against the bone before it happened. He knew the small sigh a body gave when its fight was almost done. He knew the silence that followed, and how quickly it could be broken by the scrape of the next gurney's wheels. Faces began to blur into one another. The boy became the woman became the man, and all of them became something else entirely, something that looked at him with recognition, not accusation. He could feel the brand in his palm pressing into the scalpel's handle as if the metal were melting into his skin. Each cut seemed to etch another line into the memory he could not push away. The layout of the tower's rooms, the way the corridors bent toward the operating theater, the sound of the sea hitting the island's stones far below. And then, without warning, the gurney rolled in again. He turned toward it, expecting another blurred face, another stranger bound to the table. But the figure strapped down was not a stranger. It was him, not as he was now, but as he had been when he stepped onto the island that morning. Clothes damp from the lagoon, hair tangled from the wind, eyes wide with the kind of curiosity that hadn't yet learned its price. His own chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. His hands gripped the leather straps, pulling weakly against them. Luca stepped forward, scalpel still in his hand. His mind screamed to drop it, to run, to break whatever chain bound him to this role, but his body obeyed the rhythm of the work, the ritual. He leaned over himself, staring down into eyes that were far too alive. His other self looked back at him with dawning recognition, and in that instant, every sound in the room died. The shadowed audience froze, the air itself holding its breath. Luca's other self opened his mouth. The voice that came out was raw and low, but clear. "You left us here." The words hit with a weight far greater than their sound. They were not an accusation to one man, but to all the versions of him that had stood in this room before, scalpel in hand, watching the life drain from someone who might have been saved. The brand in his palm flared white-hot, the heat surging through the blade and into the body beneath it. The room twisted, the walls bending away like something alive, and the darkness between them yawned open. The other Luca's eyes stayed locked on his, even as the floor fell away. And then the table, and the body upon it, vanished into the dark. The darkness that swallowed Luca after the table fell away was not like the absence of light. It was a thickness, a weight pressing against his chest, smothering every breath until he could not tell if he was still drawing air or only remembering the act of breathing. When the world finally shifted again, it was with a sudden, bone-deep cold. The fog was the first thing he saw, a wall of it, dense and unmoving, like a curtain drawn across the horizon. Beneath his feet, the shore was black sand, wet enough to cling to his boots. Somewhere far out on the water, a bell tolled once, and the sound rolled over him like the opening note of a verdict already decided. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. They came in pairs at first, their outlines tall and severe. As they drew nearer, he saw the masks, long-beaked visages of the plague doctors of old, their glass lenses catching the faint gray light. Their robes were heavy and dark, the hems dragging in the sand as they moved with an unsettling stillness. One by one, more joined them until they formed a half-circle before him. Behind them, the fog stirred again. A wooden structure loomed, not a gallows, not a scaffold, but a kind of raised platform, its edges carved with spirals that writhed like living things when the mist shifted. The masked figures ascended it, their movements in perfect unison, until 12 of them stood above him in 2 rows, a court without walls, its chamber the dead shore of Poveglia. The one in the center raised a gloved hand. The air stilled. "Luca Barisi," the voice said, though it came not from the mask's beak but from all around him. "You stand before this court accused of crimes that cross the span of centuries." A ripple of sound moved through the others, not speech, but the faint sigh of many voices breathing at once. The central judge spoke again. "You are charged with carrying the sickness into the city." Another mask leaned forward, "With guiding the boats that ferried the doomed to this shore." A third, voice colder still, "With tending the fires that devoured their bodies." Each accusation was like a stone dropped into water, sending out ripples that broke against him in waves. "And more," the central judge continued, "with keeping the souls here when they should have gone on." Luca's throat felt dry. "I don't understand," he began, but the fog behind the judges shifted again, and the first witness stepped forward. It was the burned survivor from the plague pits, the one who, in the stories, had lived long enough to see the sickness change into something else. His skin was blackened in patches, cracked to reveal the pale bone beneath. He stared at Luca with eyes that burned faintly, as though embers still lived behind them. "I told you," the man said, voice low but carrying. "I showed you the map. You promised to close the door." Before Luca could speak, the fog shifted again, and laughter spilled through it, high, breathless, overlapping. The children of smoke stepped into view, their outlines wavering like heat over a fire. Their hollow eyes watched him as they placed their bone-carved toys in the sand, one by one, until they formed a circle at his feet. "You played with us," they whispered together, "and then you left." More shapes emerged, the patients from the tower, their faces blurred but their mouths open in silent screams, the skeletal hand from the breathing well, still glistening with the cold damp of the depths, and behind them all, shadowed figures he could not name but felt in his bones he had known for lifetimes. The central judge's voice cut through the fog. "Do you deny them?" Luca's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because in the spaces between their faces, in the echoes of their voices, fragments of memory began to stir, images of himself not as he was now, but dressed in the plague mask, rowing the boats, lifting bodies to the pyres, drawing the same circle in X into the dirt of the island's center. Then other flashes, his own hands tying straps in the operating theater, lowering the scalpel to skin, hearing the breathless laughter of unseen children from behind locked doors. He had been here before. Not once, not twice. Again and again, across years that blurred into one another. And then, from somewhere deeper still, came another memory, heavier than the rest, the one he had buried even from himself. He was standing in the heart of the island, where the cypress trees twisted into shapes that no wind had made. The soil was black and warm, and in his hands was something small, sealed, and unbearably heavy. Its surface was marked with the same symbol now burned into his palm. He dug into the earth with his own hands, the dirt clawing at his nails, until he had made a hollow deep enough to hide it. Then he covered it over, stamping the earth flat until no sign remained. He had left it there. And whatever it was, he had left it knowing it would keep the island as it was, trapped, rotting, alive in the wrong way. The burned man stepped closer to him, his eyes narrowing. "You remember?" The children of smoke giggled, but the sound was thin and sharp. "We knew you would." The central judge lowered his hand, and the others leaned forward, their glass lenses catching the dim light like cold stars. "You will return what you buried," the voice said. "You will put it into our hands." Luca swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" The judge's head tilted slightly, the beak of the mask pointing down at him like the shadow of a blade. "Then you will join them." The fog thickened, closing in from every side. The burned man stepped to his right, the children to his left, the blurred patients moving in behind. The circle was closing, and the cold of the mist was no longer the cold of air but the cold of stone, of the deep places under the island where no light had ever lived. The judge's voice came one last time, echoing not in his ears but in the marrow of his bones. "Return it, or join us forever." And then the fog swallowed everything. The fog released him slowly, as though reluctant to let go. When it finally thinned, Luca was standing alone in the cypress forest, the black sand of the shore replaced by damp, uneven soil beneath his boots. The silence was so deep it pressed against his ears. Not even the faint roll of water on stone reached this far in. He looked down at his palm. The brand burn there had changed. The lines of the circle and X were sharper now, the skin around them pulled taut as if carved too deep. But more than that, the symbol seemed to move. Not shift randomly, it pulsed faintly, in time with his own heartbeat, sending thin threads of heat up his arm. When he turned his hand slightly, the blackened grooves caught the dim light, and he realized they were not just marks but a map. The lines bent and curved in ways he had not noticed before, and now, staring at them, he saw their shape, not the outline of the whole island, but the veins of its interior. The brand was guiding him. He took his first step forward, and the burning in his palm eased. The path wound between the cypress trunks, the roots knotted and twisted like the bodies of things that had tried to climb away from the earth and failed. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. It carried the faintest vibration, not sound exactly, but a hum beneath the skin, as if the ground itself were speaking in a voice too deep to hear. The forest opened slowly, as though each tree had to decide whether to let him pass. When it did, he found himself in a clearing unlike any other he had seen on the island. The ground here was bare, the soil black and fine, with no grass or weeds daring to grow. In the center, the earth rose into a low mound. He approached it, and the humming grew stronger. The soil beneath his boots felt soft, almost spongy, and as he knelt to touch it, a shiver ran through him. It was warm, not like the heat of the sun, but like the warmth of flesh. He pressed his palm against it, and the ground seemed to push back, pulsing faintly, as if something beneath it was alive. The brand in his hand burned again. The map had led him here. He hesitated only a moment before beginning to dig. The soil gave way easily, crumbling into his hands in dark, damp clumps. The warmth deepened as he dug, until it felt as though he were reaching into the body of some great creature. The humming rose to a low, steady thrum that he could feel in his teeth. Then his fingers struck metal. He cleared more earth, and the shape took form. A chest, half buried, its wood blackened with age, the grain splitting in places but still holding. Thick chains, their links fused with rust, wound around it in a tight web, as though whatever lay inside had to be held from every angle. The padlocks were the kind he had only seen in museums, heavy, iron, stamped with the worn crest of Venice. He brushed the last of the soil away and sat back on his heels. The chest seemed to radiate a cold that cut through the warmth of the earth. His fingers itched to touch it, though the air around it felt heavier, harder to breathe. The chains had no keys, but they were old, their rust flaking under his touch. One by one, he began to pull them loose. They resisted at first, as though remembering their purpose, but finally yielded with sharp snaps, falling into the earth like dead snakes. The last chain slid free, and the chest sat bare before him. Its hinges groaned when he touched the lid, the sound so loud in the silence that it seemed to echo far beyond the clearing. He lifted it slowly. Inside was no treasure. No gold, no documents, no relics of the plague years. It was a jar, small enough to hold in both hands, made of glass so dark it seemed almost black. Its surface was smooth except for the seal at its mouth, a band of lead hammered tight, stamped with the same circle and X as the brand on his palm. But it was what lay inside that stopped his breath. The jar was filled with smoke. Not the thin, gray drift of a dying fire, but a dense, black mass that moved as if alive. It swirled slowly, its currents folding in on themselves, pressing sometimes against the glass in a way that made it bulge almost imperceptibly, as though testing its prison. Luca's fingers tightened on the edge of the chest. He could feel it watching him, not with eyes, but with the weight of its attention, an awareness that slid against his skin like cold water. And then the humming stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. The air seemed to pull inward toward the jar, drawing the mist of the clearing ever closer. The warmth in the soil died instantly, leaving only the chill of the chains that now lay discarded at his feet. The lead seal quivered. At first it was so slight he thought it was his own vision shaking. But no, the thin strip of metal around the jar's neck was moving, flexing in tiny motions, as though something inside had hooked its fingers under it and was prying upward. A hairline crack appeared in the lead, thin and dark. Luca's breath caught. He reached for it, but his branded palm flared with such heat that his fingers stopped short. The crack lengthened, curling around the neck of the jar. The black smoke inside pressed harder against the glass, flowing toward the opening like a tide rising to breach a wall. The seal gave a sharp, metallic snap. A single thread of smoke slipped through, thin as a whisper, and curled upward into the air. The jar trembled in its bed of rotted wood. Then, without warning, the rest of the seal tore free. The jar's mouth gaped open, and the smoke surged toward him. The jar lay open in the chest, its lead seal in two twisted pieces at Luca's feet. The first tendril of black smoke had been no more than a thread, curling upward like the slow exhale of something long asleep. But now the air in the clearing began to churn, as if every shadow in the soil had been drawn toward that single point. The smoke poured out. It did not drift lazily like the mist on the lagoon. It spilled upward with intent, flowing in coils that twisted and wove together, then separated, then joined again in movements too deliberate to be chance. The ground around him darkened, the faint light from the sky swallowed in a rising wall of shadow. The hum he had felt in the soil earlier was back, but now it was inside him, pressing against his ribs with each breath. And then the shapes began to form. At first they were rough, only hints of limbs and faces, shifting and breaking apart like reflections on disturbed water. But they solidified quickly, the smoke condensing into figures, hundreds, then thousands, all standing shoulder to shoulder in the clearing and beyond, spilling into the cypress forest like a tide of human silhouettes. Every one of them was watching him. The nearest stood only a few steps away. Their faces were pale but featureless, as though whatever had shaped them had never seen a human long enough to remember the details. Where eyes should have been, there were hollows darker than the smoke itself, but he felt the weight of their gaze. Their bodies moved faintly with each breath, his breath. It was as if they inhaled when he did, and exhaled when he did not. Then as one they spoke. The sound was not loud. It was the whisper of 1,000 voices at once, low enough to curl beneath the skin, impossible to tell where one ended and another began. "Free us," they said, "and we will release you." The words slid into him like a promise and a command bound together. Luca's mouth was dry. "Release me from what?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. "From the island," the voices replied, still as one. "From what you are bound to. From what you have been and will be again." The brand in his palm burned, but not with pain, with a strange, pulling sensation, as if it were leaning toward them, yearning for contact. He took a step back. "Why were you sealed away?" The smoke shifted restlessly, the crowd of figures rippling like a field of dark grass in a wind he couldn't feel. "We were taken," they said. "We were left here. You brought some of us yourself. Others were given to us by those who feared to burn. We were bound in the jar because the living feared our hunger." Luca's instinct screamed. The air felt wrong, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with heat or cold. "If I free you," he said slowly, "what will you do?" The nearest figures leaned forward slightly, their hollow eyes glinting with a strange, wet sheen. "We will go," they said. "We will leave this place. We will let you walk away." It should have sounded like salvation. Instead, it sounded like bait. Every part of him wanted to step back, to put the chest lid down, to gather the chains and wrap them tight again. But his body stayed rooted. The smoke's movement had a rhythm now, one that matched the beat of his heart. And somewhere in that rhythm, other words began to surface. They came faintly at first, between the layers of the main voice. Fragments of confession. Snatches of language older than the city itself. And then clear as a blade drawn across stone. "We are not what was taken." Luca's breath caught. "We are what came for them." The clearing seemed to contract. The nearest figures grew taller, their forms stretching, the hollows where their eyes had been widening into pits so deep he thought he saw movement inside them. The hum in his chest became a pressure in his skull, a rising roar that felt like it would split his head open. He understood then, these were no trapped victims. They were the reason the victims had never left. They had not been bound to protect them, but to protect everything else from them. And now the jar was open. The tide of figures shifted forward as one. The black smoke that made them bled outward, breaking apart from the bodies and curling through the air toward him. It wrapped around his ankles first, cold and wet like the lagoon in midwinter. Then it climbed, sliding over his boots, up his legs, heavy enough to drag at his steps. He tried to move, but the ground seemed to hold him. The first wisp touched the skin of his wrist, and the brand flared so violently he saw nothing but white for a heartbeat. The voices surged together again. "You opened the door. You belong to us." The smoke rose higher, coiling around his chest, pushing into his mouth and nose until his lungs burned. The cold was inside him now, filling the hollows of his bones. His vision narrowed, the clearing fading into a tunnel of black. The last thing he saw before it closed entirely was the crowd pressing closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him. And then the smoke surged all at once, swallowing him whole. Luca woke to the sound of water tapping gently against wood. The motion beneath him was slow and steady, the rise and fall of a vessel adrift. For a moment he didn't move, letting the rhythm wash over him like a tide pulling him away from some distant shore. His eyelids were heavy, his mind hazy, as though the black smoke he had last seen pouring into him had been nothing more than a fevered dream. When he finally opened his eyes, he was lying on the deck of his boat. The lagoon stretched out in every direction, still as glass beneath a pale morning sky. Behind him, in the far distance, the dark shape of Poveglia lay silent. Its trees were unmoving, its shoreline empty, the mist that had wrapped it before now thin and drifting. For a long, still breath, he thought he had escaped. He sat up slowly, muscles aching, his throat dry. The air here felt clean compared to the stifling heat and rot of the island. No hum in the soil. No cold hands dragging him down. No eyes in the fog. He reached instinctively for the oars, but the movement stopped halfway. The brand in his palm, the circle and X burned into him in the depths of the plague wells, pulsed. Not with pain exactly, but with heat, each throb perfectly timed to his heartbeat. He turned his hand over. The skin was darker there than it had been, almost charred, and faint tendrils of steam curled upward from it into the cool air. The memory of the jar came rushing back, the smoke spilling upward, the thousands of human shapes forming in the clearing, the moment they had surged toward him. He should not be here. Not like this. He turned the boat toward Venice, rowing steadily. The horizon remained stubbornly far away. He passed a few fishing boats as the day wore on, their hulls low and weathered, their sails slack in the still air. He raised a hand in greeting to one, but the men aboard did not wave back. They turned their faces away as if they had not seen him at all. By afternoon, the unease had deepened. The boats he passed kept a wide berth, changing course rather than coming near. A boy in one vessel glanced toward him, his eyes widening, and then his father seized his shoulder and turned him away, saying something sharp Luca could not hear. It wasn't just the fisherman. A gull wheeled overhead, its white wings flashing in the sunlight, but when it caught sight of him, it gave a startled cry and veered sharply away. A stray dog on the docks barked wildly the moment Luca came into sight, its tail tucked so far between its legs it nearly tripped as it fled. By the time he anchored near a quiet inlet, the sun was low, its light stretched thin across the lagoon. He told himself the distance from the island was enough, that the brand's heat would fade by morning, that the strange avoidance of men and animals was nothing more than superstition clinging to him like the mist had. He ducked into the small cabin at the boat's stern. It smelled of salt and wood and the faint, metallic tang of his own tools. He set about lighting the lamp, but froze halfway through the motion. A sound had broken the stillness. It was soft at first, so faint he almost mistook it for the creak of rope or the lap of water against the hull. But it grew clearer, surer, each note ringing with the same deep, measured tone he had heard that first night when he anchored near the forbidden shore. The bell. Only now it was not coming from the island. It was coming from inside the cabin. The lamp shook in his hand. He set it down and stepped toward the narrow door at the far end, the one that led to the tiny sleeping quarters. The bell tolled again, slow and deliberate, as if marking each step he took. His palm burned hotter the closer he came, the skin around the brand tightening until it felt like it might split. He reached the door and laid his free hand against it. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been in the lingering warmth of the day. The bell tolled once more, directly on the other side. He opened the door. The light from the cabin spilled inward, falling on a shape that stood in the shadows at the far wall. It was tall, its form robed and dark, the hood drawn low over its face. One arm was raised, the hand making a slow, steady motion, beckoning him in, just as it had on that first night when his boat drifted toward Poveglia without wind or current. Only now, as the shadows shifted, he saw it more clearly. The figure's feet still did not touch the ground, and the space beneath its hood was as black as the smoke that had swallowed him whole. The shadow in the cabin did not move, but the air between it and Luca felt like a taut rope pulled tighter with every breath. Its hand, still raised in that slow beckoning gesture, did not waver. Then, without warning, it spoke. The voice was his own. Not merely similar, it was exactly his. The same timbre, the same subtle rhythm, the same inflection he heard when he muttered to himself in thought. And the words it spoke slid under his skin like ice. "We never left." The heat in his branded palm flared until he almost cried out, but the sound caught in his throat. The cabin swayed faintly, though the water outside was calm. Shadows bled from the figure, spilling across the floor toward him in thin, curling tendrils. When they touched his boots, the world around him broke apart. The wood of the cabin softened and sagged like wax, the lamplight stretching into thin lines before vanishing altogether. The smell of salt water faded, replaced by something warmer, the scent of fresh bread, spiced wine, fish sizzling over an open fire. Voices rose, dozens of them mingling in the bright murmur of a busy day. He blinked and the cabin was gone. He was standing in sunlight. The air was bright and clear, and the wind carried the cries of gulls overhead. The streets of Poveglia lay before him, not the ruined, silent island he had walked through, but a place alive. The houses were whole, their shutters thrown wide, baskets of flowers spilling color over the windowsills. Boats lined the shore, their hulls bright with fresh paint, their sails snapping gently in the breeze. A marketplace stretched across the square, filled with stalls draped in cloth, their tables piled with goods, glistening fish, baskets of figs, bolts of dyed fabric, trinkets carved from bone and shell. Merchants called out their prices, children darted between the stalls, and the air was thick with the mingled smells of food, animals, and the sea. For a moment, Luca simply stood there, absorbing it. It was beautiful. It was wrong. He began to walk, weaving between the stalls. A woman in a red scarf passed him, balancing a basket on her hip, but when he glanced at her, his steps faltered. Her face was pleasant, smiling even, but where her eyes should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretched unbroken from brow to cheek. He turned away quickly, his stomach tightening. A man selling eels called out to him, lifting one in each hand. The tone was friendly, but when Luca met his gaze, the same absence was there, no eyes, only hollows deeper than shadow. A boy raced past, laughing, and Luca caught the empty sockets in his face before the child vanished into the crowd. It was not just some. It was all of them. Every single person in the market moved, spoke, smiled, and none of them had eyes. The heat in his palm began to pulse again. He stopped in the center of the square. The crowd's flow shifted subtly, bodies angling as if drawn toward him. The voices lowered. Heads turned. One by one, the eyeless faces fixed on him. A ripple passed through them, a wave of stillness that silenced the market completely. And then, as if rehearsed, they spoke. "Welcome home, doctor." The words rolled over him in perfect unison, not loud, but deep enough to make the air feel heavier. His breath came fast, his throat tightening. The crowd began to move again, but now their steps were deliberate, closing the distance between them. Hands reached out, some gloved, some bare, fingers curling slightly as though ready to take hold. The eyeless faces tilted upward toward him, and though there were no pupils, he felt the weight of their gaze more than if there had been. "Welcome home, doctor." The phrase came again, louder now, echoing against the walls of the square. The sound layered on itself, becoming a chant. The market stalls seemed to recede, the bright colors of cloth and fruit draining away until only muted tones remained. The air warmed, not with the sun but with the same inner heat he had felt on the mound at the island's heart. He stepped back, but the space behind him closed instantly. They were all around him now, their bodies forming a tight ring. The chant did not stop. "Welcome home, doctor." Faces blurred at the edges, like paint washed by rain, revealing hints of the shapes they had been. Plague masks, hospital patients, children carved from smoke. The marketplace itself seemed to shift under his feet, the cobblestones softening, the stalls bending, until he was not standing in the square at all but in the courtyard of the hospital tower. The high walls leaned inward, shadowing the space in the same sickly yellow light he had seen before. The crowd pressed closer. In the far distance, beyond the courtyard, a sound broke through the chant. Deep and slow, carrying over the rooftops, through the streets, across the water. The bell. It rang once, the sound stretching long and low. Every head turned toward the sound in unison, but their bodies did not move. The air between them thickened. Luca's brand burned like a brand pressed fresh from the fire, the pain sharp enough to drive him to his knees. The bell tolled again. The crowd leaned in as one, the eyeless faces tilting closer until he could see the faint shimmer of movement in the dark where their eyes should have been. Not emptiness, but smoke, swirling faintly, waiting. "Welcome home, doctor," they said one last time. The bell rang for the third and final time, and the world went black. And so, the last echo of the bell fades into the dark, yet its weight lingers in the air, as if the island still remembers you, still waits for your return. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some truths, once heard, will follow you beyond the shore. Perhaps tonight, when the wind shifts over the water, you too will hear it, the slow toll that calls to those who have walked too close to forgotten places. If this journey through shadowed history has stirred something in you, if you felt the chill of the past pressing close, the pull of secrets buried in ash and bone, then do not let this be where we part. There are more roads through lost cities, more curses that whisper from behind the veil of time, more stories that will not rest until they are told. Leave your thoughts in the comments, your theories, your questions, the moments that stayed with you, and share this with those who dare to follow the same path. And if you would walk with us into the next legend, like this, share it and subscribe. The next bell could be for you.